So, let's say you've just been playing some Super Smash Bros. And you get to thinking, hey, that Fire Emblem series must be pretty good with how many characters are on the roster. I should try one out. And you decide that you want to start with not just any Fire Emblem, but the first one, the story of Marth. Well, you're in luck, hypothetical person, because there are not one, not just two, but 3 different versions of Fire Emblem 1, all with pros and cons. These are Fire Emblem 1, Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, Fire Emblem 3, Mystery of the Emblem, Book 1, and Fire Emblem 11, Shadow Dragon. And in this video, I'm going to break down the differences between each version, what was improved over time, and what was lost. To give away the game a bit, there is no definitive version of Fire Emblem 1. The one that started it all. Released in 1990 exclusively in Japan, other regions would not receive an official localization until the 30th anniversary of the franchise. For reasons known only to Nintendo, that release was sadly a limited time offer that has since expired, although I personally suspect it will end up on the Virtual NES at some point in time. Playing through the game for the first time, I was struck by how fully formed it is. While it lacks a lot of the systems that have come to be associated with the franchise, such as supports or the weapon triangle, the rock-solid foundation of Fire Emblem has been there from the start. The story of Fire Emblem 1 sees the Prince Marth set out on a journey to reclaim his kingdom and defeat the titular Shadow Dragon, Midius. Along the way, he amasses an army of recruits from across the continent, with the player choosing which units they want to deploy on each mission. The story is a standard tale of a hero's journey with few meaningful surprises. But considering the context of the system it released on, it's perfectly serviceable for what it is. The story is there primarily to give context for the gameplay and the characters. And it's the gameplay that makes Fire Emblem 1 shine. As in the modern entries, you spend the bulk of your time moving your units across a grid in order to fight the enemy army. If your units get enough experience from fighting, they level up and get stronger. But if they are defeated in battle, the unit dies and is lost forever unless a player restarts the console. This fundamental tension to every single combat encounter is why the game is so compelling. Because your units are immortal, every decision has weight. And there are some definite rough mechanical edges to this first release. You have to manually count enemy ranges, for instance, instead of being able to just click a button and see them as in newer entries. The harshest hurdle to a modern player is the inventory management. Trading items between your units is a complete hassle, as a character can only give items on their own turn, and only if the receiving unit has a free inventory space. The game also has the heavily derided ambush spawns, enemy units that appear and attack on the same turn, which can lead to deaths that feel out of the player's control. However, a lot of these rough edges are mitigated by a few factors. The first of these is the low difficulty. Since experience point gains aren't reduced for higher level units, characters in Fire Emblem 1 quickly snowball. Your best units end up dramatically outpacing the growth in enemy difficulty. So while inventory management and checking enemy ranges is a pain, you don't have to worry about optimizing everything perfectly, as it doesn't really matter. The official localization also added a couple features such as turn rewind and a speed modifier that make the experience a bit smoother. The original Fire Emblem 1 was a very slow NES game, and that speed modifier really does help. I tried not to use these much in my playthrough, as I wanted a play experience closer to that of the original, but I'll admit to using the speed modifier during some of the later chapters, where enemy turns could take several minutes at a time. Overall, I found myself having a remarkably fun time with the gameplay, even if it didn't require me to think too hard. Importantly, I also found myself enjoying the characters in the game, even though most have only a few lines of dialogue. It's fun to see why some of these characters left such a big impression on the Japanese fanbase, despite that lack of characterization. One big reason is that the portraits are very expressive, occasionally to the point of comedy. Cain and Abel's smirks are hilarious, and I adore pretty boy Julian's side-on smolder. Unfortunately, not every character is as fortunate due to the NES's constraints. In Chapter 2, 3 axe fighters join up and they all have the same portrait with minor palette swaps. But there is just enough to the characters in Fire Emblem 1 for the player to have some attachment to their units, beyond simply being strong at combat. And this is crucial to the experience working. Neither the writing nor the gameplay in this early outing have much in the way of depth, but the two work in conjunction to create a deeply compelling experience. You care just enough about the characters to feel a twang when you accidentally leave one in the range of a strong enemy and see them die. On the whole, Fire Emblem 1 is a shockingly enjoyable experience considering its age. If you're interested in the history of Fire Emblem or strategy role-playing games as a genre, I highly recommend playing through it for yourself. In the context of gaming in 1990, it is an incredible title, and it's easy to see why it sparked a franchise and helped define the genre. The first remake to Fire Emblem 1 came out just 4 years after the original's release. When Intelligent Systems made the leap to the new Super Nintendo Entertainment System, they chose to make a sequel to the very first game in the series. But just in case any prospective player had missed out on the first game, they included a remake of that campaign as well. At the time of this video, FE3 remains unlocalized, although there is a very rough fan patch. FE3 Book 1 is a largely faithful remake of the first game, with a couple concessions. Because Fire Emblem 3 has 2 campaigns on its cartridge, Intelligent Systems cut 5 maps from the original Shadow Dragon's level campaign. Additionally, they cut a handful of minor characters entirely. Because that original game's roster was already so large, the loss of these characters isn't felt very strongly, although the removal of a certain late-game mage is very unfortunate. But in exchange for these cuts, Fire Emblem 3 improves on nearly every aspect of the original. The SNES's expanded color palette allows for a much nicer looking game, and both the tiles and character portraits are massively improved. The writing in the game is mostly the same as the original Shadow Dragon, although some minor changes were made to better lay the groundwork for the sequel and additionally flesh out the world. More importantly are the number of mechanical changes that make it a much smoother experience. You can now click on an enemy to see their range, and the overhauled item management system makes trading far more convenient than it had previously been. However, there is one big negative gameplay change: the introduction of unit dismounting. In both books of Fire Emblem 3, for indoor maps, units on horses or Pegasi have to dismount and fight on foot, losing both movement and combat ability as they are locked to swords. For Book 2, this is less of an issue as the maps were designed with dismounting in mind. But it doesn't feel natural in Book 1 because the original Shadow Dragon didn't have this mechanic, and some of those late game maps are much more annoying than they were originally intended to be. But on the whole, Fire Emblem 3 Book 1 is a really great experience that I would highly recommend. The SNES Fire Emblems all look and play great, and this is no exception. While the cuts are a source of contention for many fans, I personally think the loss of that content is minor, and the improvements more than make up for it. The improvements to item management and information availability just make an already good experience even better. And because it goes straight into Book 2, you can experience the entirety of Marth's tale on one game. Intelligent Systems would wait another 14 years before deciding to remake Fire Emblem 1 again. Released worldwide in 2008, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon is a mostly faithful remake of the first Fire Emblem. To be honest, this faithfulness is to its detriment. The map design is nearly identical to the NES original, as is the writing. By this point, improvements to both of these would have been very welcome. Additionally, a couple of the changes that were made serve to undermine a lot of the experience. But first, the positives. The gameplay is more frictionless than it has ever been. You can now toggle an option to show all enemy ranges, or toggle individual enemy ranges at will. The dual screens of the Nintendo DS are a perfect fit for Fire Emblem, allowing it to easily digest the large amounts of information that players have to juggle. Shadow Dragon also provides the most difficulty options of any game in the series, so whether you are a first-time player or a Fire Emblem veteran such as myself, you can have an enjoyable, challenging experience that suits your level of play. One of the most welcome changes is that the majority of the cast gets an additional conversation to build their character, typically with Marth or Sita on their joining map. These small snippets of dialogue help flesh out characters a little bit more than their NES and SNES counterparts, but I wish they'd gone further, as a lot of the cast still feels very indistinct. And unfortunately, the other changes Intelligent Systems made serve to further undermine the characters, and consequently the gameplay loop. One of the biggest mechanical changes made in this entry is the ability to freely reclass units into different roles. For instance, the Paladin Jagan is served much better by reclassing into a Draco Knight. However, reclassing removes a lot of the distinctive traits of units in gameplay. In a lot of Fire Emblem, Cavaliers are great units solely because of the class. In this entry, since other units can just as easily become Cavaliers, that advantage no longer exists. Because reclassing changes stats as well, and because enemy stats are very inflated on higher difficulties, the gap between good and bad characters feels a lot less distinct than in other titles. Reclassing thus serves to make units feel less unique and stand out less. Because everyone can do everything, only a few special units stand out, such as those with abnormally high growths or personal stats, or those with personal weapons such as Sita. It also muddles characters to have distinctive units be in different classes. It just feels wrong to have the popular silent swordsman Navarre ride a horse, even if that is the best way to make use of him. But because reclassing is such a powerful gameplay mechanic that is essentially required on higher difficulties, it's difficult to ignore even if one decides to. Further weakening characterization is the change in art style. Shadow Dragon uses a very desaturated color scheme for both map tiles and character portraits. This color scheme does the game no credit. Fire Emblem is a typically light-hearted series with larger-than-life characters, and this super desaturated look feels out of place. The GBA entry's much more colorful look is a far better fit for the series. In addition to the dull color scheme, every character has the same expression in their portrait. To illustrate how much worse these character portraits got, let's look at the portrait of my favorite thief Julian one more time. Here's his Fire Emblem 1 portrait again. Look at the expressiveness of his stance. No other character in that game has a completely side-on view like Julian. Even though he doesn't have a ton of dialogue in the first game, between his portrait and those short conversations he has with Alina, he has a ton of character. His Fire Emblem 3 portrait is similarly expressive. Because the portrait is shared between books 1 and 2, it portrays a slightly more mature Julian. He no longer has a mischievous smile, but he retains a side-on view, illustrating his cool guy persona. Again, the portrait is providing significant characterization for a very minor character. And finally, here is his Shadow Dragon portrait. What does it tell you about the character? Sure, he's reaching to cover his face, illustrating that he's a thief. But that's something you already know from his introduction and from his unit class. Overall, the FE11 portrait provides much less characterization than either FE1 or FE3's. And Julian has one of the better Shadow Dragon portraits. The sum total of the changes to the art style and reclassing is that Shadow Dragon's cast actually feels less defined than it did in the very first game on the NES. While the new dialogue is a welcome change, it's not enough to make up for the removal of personality in both gameplay and art. While I eventually began to enjoy my time with Shadow Dragon, as the tactical gameplay remains a lot of fun, I found myself caring about unit deaths less than I had in my previous outings on Arcanea. The characters feeling so indistinct has real consequences for the gameplay and my level of enjoyment. So, which game should you play? Well, it really depends on what you're looking for. As I said up top, there is no definitive version of Fire Emblem 1. If you are interested in the historical context of the franchise, the first game remains a perfectly enjoyable experience. If you're looking for just a strong strategic gameplay experience, the 2008 Shadow Dragon is probably the strongest in that regard. And if you want something that has a good mixture of polish and presentation at the cost of some small content, Fire Emblem 3 Book 1 is probably your best bet. But really, if you're completely new to the franchise, I'd recommend starting with an entirely different game. Every version of Shadow Dragon is flawed. Which one you choose really is up to your personal preference. Thanks for watching this far into my first video. I've been bouncing this idea around for a while, so I hope you got something out of it. I've got a few more ideas for Fire Emblem videos that I might make if the reception to this is positive. So if you enjoyed, feel free to subscribe and let me know that you'd like to see more. Thanks.